It's great to be here. This is my first visit to Perth. I was told that when I came to Western Australia that apparently nobody in Australia cares about New Zealand, was the first thing I was told. And the second thing they said was, when you come to Western Australia, everybody cares about, they don't care about the East. So I feel like I'm, slightly dangerous territory here. But anyway, it's very good to be here. I was asked to talk about scholarly publishing, and I'm going to I want to talk to you about it in the context of a lot of different bits and pieces. And the title that I came up with was Snakes and Ladders. Now, of course, one of the things I really love about Australia, having not been here terribly long, is the dangerous wildlife, and when I came here, everybody was kind of joking about it. So I thought Snakes and Ladders would be a good title for the talk. I'm going to not talk actually about too many snakes, but I do want to talk about why I think kind of ladders or tools are important, because one of the things that I hear a lot about when I talk with academics is the need to understand, or the need to know more about the current scholarly publishing landscape, which is getting pretty complex. It's very interesting. I think it's really fascinating. And there are lots of things have changed from when many of us used to publish a few years ago. So that's the general theme. So that's the last time you'll see a ladder, but there you go. That was my intention when I set this up. Okay. Oh, no, hang on. Let me try to do this. All right. So, not so much a ladder. I think it's a toolbox. This is what we need. And if you were to, if I were to give this slide, actually even 5 years ago, I think there'd only be one or two of these things on it, probably only one of them. And why do they matter? It's because when you're publishing nowadays, it's not just about picking the journal, throwing it into the peer review and seeing what comes out at the end. There's a whole range of extra complex things that are happening. And I guess what it would be really good to hopefully have a sense of for you at the end of this is what these tools are, why they're particularly useful, and how they can help you avoid some of the real pitfalls that I think there are in scholarly publishing now, but also to use your research to make sure it actually gets disseminated in the way that you want it to get disseminated. So this is a slide that if you've ever seen me talk, I apologise. I've put this up a few times. I've actually been using it for quite a few years now. And I think the most amazing thing about this is it talks about the future of the web, but it also talks about the fact that we never actually, when it was invented, we didn't really understand what the possibilities associated with it were. James Boyle, who wrote this, is somebody who's done a huge amount of thinking on the web and the future of it. And he makes the point that if we were to invent the internet right now, we probably would, we wouldn't understand the possibilities that were associated with it. And I think we'd actually probably do things that would put boundaries around it that would make it not as useful as it could be. And what's happened, I think, is that because the internet grew up in the way that it did, many areas of publishing, areas of society more generally, have exploited the internet in a way that scholarly publishing simply hasn't. And one of my frustrations, I think, is that particularly academics have for a very long time ended up being in this world where they've not been able to exploit the possibilities. So I guess where I see the future is that we begin to really use it for what it can do. However, saying all that, we have gone quite a long way from the beginning of publishing. So this is for those of you that haven't been paying attention to anniversaries, this is the 350th anniversary of the Royal Society's first scholarly journal. I went to a meeting in the UK on it a few weeks ago, which was it was quite funny. It was on the future of scholarly publishing. So it was at the Royal Society, which, if you've ever been to the Royal Society, has an enormous number of pet portraits of mostly elderly white men in wigs around the walls. There were quite a lot of elderly men in the room, actually, frankly. And we were supposed to be discussing the future of scholarly publishing. So at one point, somebody said, we actually just need to do this meeting again with people a generation younger, and then we can really talk about the future. It was quite a weird meeting, but it was good. And there was something that came out of it, which I'll come back to, really, I think it made a lot of people think quite hard about what the future had to be. However, the Royal Society is also interesting because they're a publisher themselves. And for quite a long time, they were quite cautious, I would say, about open access in a way that was quite interesting. And then in 2014, they launched a very nice open access journal, which is this one. It's called the Royal Society Open Science. So it only took them, 349 years to join the revolution, but never mind, they got there in the end. And it's published some really fascinating things. And the most interesting thing I think about it is that this is a journal that is beginning to exploit the fact that publishing nowadays needs to move beyond just what is essentially a web version of an original publication like this, the PDF, which is what most academics, I think, still find most useful, to things where the main publication actually is some sort of media. So, for example, this one is I'm not going to play it, but if you have a chance, do look at it. This is a beautiful example of where the primary information within the paper is a lovely video of this beautiful thing, which is Ruby the Red Sea Dragon, which is was discovered in the Western Australian Museum and was reclassified earlier this year as a new species of sea dragon. And so the whole point of this is that the paper itself, to some extent, is an ancillary to what the primary data is, which is the description, the physical description of the new animal. Okay, so we've gone from online. The next stage, I think, is going to be moving into open. Now, there are lots of uses of the word open. Some of them are the right use, and some of them are the wrong use. And I think, again, one of the things I would very much like to get the idea across is the understanding of what open means in the this current scholarly publishing landscape. So these are examples of what I would think are good examples of being open. So we have the open access logo, which originally was designed by somebody at PLOS, which has now been translated into data, which is very much, I think, the new frontier of publishing. We have initiatives around repositories and access to research in Europe. We have journals adopting it, open chemistry, and all of this is underpinned by what I think is the really critical part of all of this, which is the idea of the licenses associated with publishing. And this has spawned the development of things such as Science Commons, for example. But there is great confusion about what the difference between online and open, and the difference between free and open is. And understanding all of that, I feel, is really important to how we think about the future. So I think if we're going to start, I'm going to use some examples of things which I think everybody needs to be equipped with to understand the new landscape. So the first one is around the idea of how open is it. This is an example that came out of a group of organisations which included PLOS and the Scholarly Publishers, Scholarly Libraries Association in the US, and it's a way of thinking about how open is it. So if you were to ask a lot of people what they mean by open access, there is often this conception that being free is the most important thing. But if you, I don't know how much well this is going to project. This is available online, so please do go and look at it afterwards. One thing that this does very well is to make give you the idea that there are different dimensions of openness and different things that you need to be aware of to think about it. So they start from, for example, over here, which is the author rights. Can you see that? The reader rights. And over here, to the machine readability of the paper itself. And this is primarily for journals. There is a tool being developed which is for individual papers. And the most important thing about this is that it's not trying to, I think, be prescriptive about, this is just one way of thinking about open. What it's doing is saying if you have something in front of you and you want to understand whether something is open or not, this gives you a way of looking at it. So, for example, it ranges from full readership rights through to having to pay a subscription down here, machine readability with an open API, down to inability to download the full text. And what I think this shows really well is that actually it's incredibly hard to have things that are fully open access, even with publishers that are doing their best around it. Because the technology around making things machine readable is actually very hard if you're going to do it in a useful way. And this is something that even the most dedicated open access publishers are actually really struggling with. So this is the whole concept of this. It's the open versus free, and the open is greater than free. And I think this is the concept that I spend a lot of time talking to people about. So free access is this idea that something is free online, often after a waiting period. So you'll often hear this used as a synonym for open, and it really isn't, because this is what open access is. It's 4 things, all of which are absolutely critical. So the first one is the free online access, but it's the immediate access. The second is around the copyright and the right to attribution. The third one is the license which permits reuse, and the fourth one is the secure archiving. And all of these were established quite a long time ago by a number of different groups that got together to think about it. And the one that is the most important, which I think is the most poorly understood in many ways, is this idea of reuse. And if you look at a lot of the works that, for example, publishers are doing around open access, there is quite a lot of confusion around open versus free, and quite a lot of confusion around what you can use and what you can reuse. And it's hard not to think that some of this confusion is deliberate. So I would just urge you to have a think about when you're looking at licenses, when you're looking at publishing, whether or not these are, whether these things are explained clearly. So when you do have open access, when you are thinking about open access, there are a number of different routes to get to it. And the first one is the gold open access route, which is the more traditional one that I'm most familiar with when it comes to publishing, and it's the model that the Public Library of Science is based on, or Biomed Central. And then the other route to it is green. And I think that in Australia, I'll come on to why this is important in a minute, the primary route is green open access. And why reuse becomes so important will become clear in a minute, because the repositories are in a very interesting space in the whole discussion around open access. And it's in many ways, the gold open access is simpler to understand, but has its own challenges, as many of you will know. But when you do have open access, there is no doubt that there are many benefits for researchers in the dissemination of their work. So just to touch on a few of these, which I think people, researchers in particular, find very important, is there is very good evidence, good and accumulating evidence, that open access leads to higher citation rates. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence around how research gets into policy because of the readership that happens outside of a discipline that happens with it. And one of the things I hear very often from academics is the cross-disciplinary research, the cross-disciplinary collaborations that happen because of open access. People will say something like, well, I only read this article because it was freely available, there you go, free again, or openly available, because my institution would not have subscribed to it. So you'll have a biochemist who will read something in an engineering journal that they would not normally get access to if it were not freely available. And there are other associated benefits that I won't touch on here, but I think have been well documented. And the whole thing that underpins all this is the legal tool for open access. So I'm a bit of a bore about licenses, so I'm really sorry about this, but I'm a huge fan of Creative Commons. I'm a huge fan of legal licenses. And the reason for it is because it enshrines your rights as an author, and it makes it very clear what you can and can't do. So the one that you'll be most familiar with is the Creative Commons attribution license. But there are a number of other ones, for example, ones that require you to attribute but also to share alike. So that's the CC BY share alike. And there are some associated with non-commercial rights, etc., etc. And the whole point of these licenses is there are 3 parts to it. So the first part is the legal code, which is pretty long and detailed. The second bit, which is actually, I'm really sorry to say, the most unimportant bit, is the human readable bit. The most important bit is the machine readable bit, because a lot of people think that the future of science publishing certainly the future of science aggregation is going to be what the machines can do with research. And there's currently a big case going on in the EU around the rights to reuse articles that is being fought in discussions between, in the European Parliament, between the publishers and the people who are developing laws around reuse. And it will, I think, if it goes the right way, fundamentally allow us to do great things with the reuse of information that we haven't been able to do before. But there's a huge amount of pushback coming from the publishers because they understand that it infringes their rights in ways that they are, very uncomfortable about. But when you do have a license and you want to read it as a human, this is what it looks like. And so this is just from a PLOS article. And the beauty of it is it's completely clear. You know exactly, if you read this, you know exactly what you can do with it. You know who's got the copyright, which is the author. It's not the publisher. And it tells you, what you have to do if you want to reuse it. You simply have to credit the author. And so if you're looking at articles which are open access or say they're open access, if they don't say something like this on it, you need to be wary about it. So I would, again, as an author, as a researcher, a good tool for thinking about what you can do with an article is what's actually enshrined on the paper itself. Now, so saying, having talked about gold open access publishing, the Australian approach to open access is largely green, and that's based around repositories. And this came out of a number of decisions that were made a few years ago about the funding of repositories, but also a more philosophical decision about how open access was going to be funded here. And it's very different, for example, from the UK, which is primarily funded around gold open access. And there are some very interesting discussions going on in the UK right now about what the implications were of going down a route for gold open access, primarily around where the funds for the open access are ending up. And you probably won't be surprised to know that the outcome has actually been that most of the funding for gold open access publishing is not going to the new publishers who are sort of kind of coming into the space. It's going into the pockets of the publishers, the more established publishers who've managed to develop business models that have been very successful. Okay, so I won't dwell on this too much, but you'll know, of course, that the NHMRC and the ARC have supported green open access. And so, again, looking at the Australian context compared with the UK and the US, in the UK, there are, the funders have made policies around gold open access, but in addition to the biggest funders in the UK, there are also a number of very small funders of research, and they have sort of been variable in their uptake of open access. And in the US, it's all a complete mess, I think it would be fair to say. There's huge fights going on between the publishing industry and between the granting bodies and such like, which has led to real confusion about the route going forward. In Australia, it's been pretty straightforward and largely driven by these two big funders. And so this is, I'm sure I hope you're all familiar with the research repository here. It is, I think, probably worth re-emphasising. The route of the research repository and green open access is, I think, has the potential to be incredibly transformative in publishing. And Australia is in a very interesting place to be able to exploit that. That is not the case really anywhere else in the world. There are lots of issues around reusability and lots of issues around usability of the repositories, but I think what's going to happen over the next few years is these are going to increasing importance, and it'll be very interesting to see how that plays into the whole landscape. Okay. All right, so I've talked a lot about access and the tools for, I guess, looking at research accessibility. I'd like to sort of switch tack a little bit and talk about other things that are happening within publishing right now. So if you were to ask most academics what they think of the peer review process, if you're not involved in publishing, they kind of think that this black box contains, a bunch of ogres who, take your paper, usually do some terrible peer review with it, and then spit it out the other end or not, and it's all a very painful process. I've seen lots of comments on this. This is one of my favourite ones. if you're a Twitter person and you're not following the Twitter academics, Lego academics, I would fully recommend it. What is particularly interesting about this is that I think it encompasses in a very few number of characters what many people find very frustrating with the current publishing system. And so what is happening in the whole of scholarly publishing right now is that there is this mix of technology around access and this technology around different tools of publishing that is changing in a very dramatic way. And we're seeing a shake-up that I think has the potential to be really transformative, but we're in the middle of it right now. And I know that a lot of people find it very uncomfortable and don't really sort of understand what all the possibilities are. So if that's what the academics want, I sort of decided to populate this with something that might look a bit, what the future might look a little bit like. What I do think is going to happen are a number of things. So the first thing is going to happen, I think, is we're going to see a decreasing importance of traditional peer review. I don't think it's going to go away completely, but I think it will become much more open, and I think it will become something that people are more comfortable with. I think there's going to be much more of a emphasis on preprints and on postprints, and there's going to be many more people involved in the whole process, and we're certainly seeing that right now. And the two things about this that I think are worth thinking about is that, first of all, I think we're all going to have to get more comfortable with being much more open about how we do scholarly research. And the second thing is there will be a large issue around managing all of this. And if any of you follow the debates that are happening, particularly in social media on this right now, I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable with the whole idea that publishing is becoming very complex and that it's becoming much more open. And the idea that when you publish a paper, it's not the last thing that happens to you. There will be comments that happen afterwards. And I think we certainly when I was at PLOS as a publisher, it was something we found our academics, researchers were the most uncomfortable with. But it's coming, and there's nothing much we can do about it. Okay, so what this has led to, however, is we have this huge evolution in the types of publishing that are happening. So I just want to, it's worth looking at how these have kind of evolved from each other and what the differences are. And these are, of course, by no means all of the publishers that are out there. In the publication space, I think Biomed Central was the first open access publisher, really, that did anything at scale. Although PLOS came after, was largely modelled on Biomed Central, although it took a different approach to the types of journals that originally published. And out of that has come journals such as PeerJ and eLife, both of which actually are run by people who used to be at PLOS, and BMJ Open, which came out of a model which was very similar to PLOS One. And each of these has done different things with innovation. And again, when I was talking at the beginning, I said that there used to be this route that people were very comfortable with the idea that you just submit your journal to a paper to a journal. It has a type of peer review that you're comfortable with, and you sort of understand what's going to pop out at the end. You might not enjoy the process, but it's kind of something you're familiar with. At each of these journals, something quite different might happen with your paper as it goes through. So, for example, at BMJ Open, peer review is completely open. So if you're a reviewer for there, you probably want to know that. You might not feel very comfortable about it if you don't like signing your reviews. At PeerJ, there are a number of different innovations, include the editorial processes. So, for example, they have a preprint server that you can use. The peer review can be open or closed. You can, as an author, you can choose to have your peer reviews published with your paper or not. And they have a funding model which is rather different from others. At eLife, again, they have another innovation in the editorial process. And my point here is not to, say anything more, except that as an academic, it's worth understanding all these different models and being aware of them. But at the same time, they sit within an enormous, role of publishing, which is an enormous set of different types of publishing. So, again, it can be very hard to know which of these you can trust and which you can't. And I think there are a number of different ways of thinking about this. So the ones that I put up here are all ones that are doing interesting things and I think are ones that one could be comfortable publishing in. But we also know there are journals like this. I'm sure you've all had these types of emails pop into your inbox with being solicited, asked for your articles or being asked to review for them. It can be incredibly hard, I think, to know which of these journals you might trust. Anyone want to tell me which of the journals you might feel comfortable with? If you didn't see my talk this morning, you can't... Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is it's really hard to tell. So this one here is actually a Biomed Central journal, and is one that I think you'd be reasonably comfortable with. The other two are journals that ones that are I would have no confidence in publishing in. And it's very, very hard, I think, because I know many academics feel incredibly flooded with these papers, these requests for publications that are submitted that come to them, don't know what to do with them. So one of the things that has happened in this space is that groups have grown up to try and help authors decide where they should be able to publish. There are some attempts to develop blacklists, so you may be familiar with some of these. This is a group of organisations, and I'll include COPE here, which is one of the organisations I'm involved with, which has attempted to come up with a way of helping authors decide where they might publish by giving them some criteria to look at. So the other organisations that are involved, the Directory of Open Access Journals and the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, and actually just today we published these principles, or we published the updated version of them, and I'd encourage you to look at them, because what we're trying to do is to give some things to consider when you're trying to pick your journals to look at. One of the ways of thinking about this is, well, if we come up with a blacklist, will that be the be all and end of it? And I tend to think of it as, it's the equivalent of the banking scams of the 10 years ago or so, when we all were encouraged to put our money into banks in strange places. Nobody ever thought that one should try and regulate all these banks. The truth was you had to give people tools to understand that they were not legitimate, and this is what we've tried to do. And they include things, for example, like just two I've put up here, one around author fees and one around copyright. If somebody comes to you, they ask you to submit a paper to them, these are the types of things you should be using to think about. But also, I would say, use the resources of the people around you, your librarians, colleagues. We do hear, really horrible examples of where people have submitted their papers to journals like this, and then they've discovered they're not legitimate, and it's led to real difficulties. Your institution may say that you can't submit it for ERA. It might not even be counted in HERDEC, which can be a huge problem. So, again, it's about understanding how to negotiate your way through these journals. I'm running slightly out of time, but I do want to just quickly mention EQUATOR, which is also a great way of understanding a little bit more about how articles are reported. Came out of the Clinical Trials Initiative, the consort, which you may be familiar with, and has now grown into a place where has many different examples of good reporting, and I think has been very useful, I think, for academics, and it's very useful also if you're looking at a journal and want to understand whether or not they conform to quality guidelines. It does give you a good suggestion that these ones are reputable. Okay, I'm going to jump over a couple of things. So other tools for identifying people. So we all know this kind of problem. We've all seen papers with hundreds of authors. It's kind of bad enough if your name is something like mine, which has a few possible ways of looking at it. But if you've got a very common name like Wang, you're kind of in real trouble here, because who on earth is going to be able to tell what you did on this paper? So who's the tool that has been developed for this is called ORCID. Who's got an ORCID identifier in this room? Okay. Who's never heard of ORCID? Oh, okay, well, there you go. So your take-home message for today is go and get your ORCID ID. It's incredibly important. I think it's going to be the thing that really enables people to capture their entire academic output in a way that we've not been able to do before. It's a DOI for people. And I often think that it's one of these examples, which is particularly fantastic for women, because if you published in your maiden name and then your married name, the chances are you've completely lost your ability to have all your stuff in one place. And so this person down here is a great example of that. She's clearly changed her name several times. You can have one number, you can link it all together. Other things that are coming, so figuring out how to attribute what you did. So you saw that previous paper didn't have, actually that paper didn't have a list of attributions on it. This one does, but if you look at this, all the contributions, you couldn't possibly figure out who did what on that. I mean, it's completely meaningless, isn't it? What on earth did the person who was the, conceived and designed the experiments, that's not really a tremendously helpful way of listing things. A tool has been developed called Credit, which is coming. It's being built into some publishers' databases now, and this will allow you to give very accurate attribution of what you did, and also electronically link it to ORCID. So again, it's a nice example, I think, of technology which is allowing us to solve some real basic problems about how authors get credit for what they do. I'll skip over that. And then look, I just want to kind of quickly talk about some other things that have happened. So one of them is around tools for peer review. So this is my, I think that, again, I talked to you about the idea that you throw everything into the black box. As often happens, there are certain areas in publishing which jump ahead of others. So I think one of the mistakes that sometimes happens with publishers or with is that they try to fit everybody into the same sort of box, everybody does the same thing. So the physicists have been a long way ahead of many areas of academic publishing. Are there any physicists in the room? Okay. It's true, isn't it? So archive.org was a preprint server that came along a long time before many other areas were thinking about it. And this is a great example of a paper that absolutely, I think, needs to be on a preprint service. Anyone read it? Oh, this is a really important paper. This is the paper that says that things go faster than the speed of light, okay? And which is a pretty scary finding. And these authors posted it on archive.org, and then they put up this text which says, given the potential far-reaching consequences of such a result, yeah, you kind of think so, wouldn't you? Independent measurements are needed. And so they basically were asking for this to be looked at, to be replicated, to be analysed, and for somebody to tell them, where they went wrong. And sure enough, that's what happened. It was found to be there was some anomaly in the measuring, and this paper was subsequently revised. And I think it's a great use of pre-publication public peer review, which is really important for something like this, which is a potentially world-shaking result. You absolutely want to know whether it's robust, and if it's not robust, how you handle it. Okay, so I'll skip over these. And then, again, other things that are coming. Tools for commenting are changing. It used to be when you wanted to submit a letter to the editor, you had to submit it within 2 or 3 weeks. It had to be formatted in a certain way. It had to be 250 words. They'd spend 6 weeks looking at it, and then they'd reject it. Nowadays, you can write a letter. You can post it on PubMed Commons, which is a new tool that's been developed on top of PubMed, and it allows you to very easily comment. And I think it will change the post-publication dialogue. Same with things like Twitter. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about social media, but I do think, again, Twitter has been quite revolutionary in discussions post-publication, and we're just going to see more of it, whether we like it or not. And then I'm just going to touch very quickly on tools for assessment. Again, we're all tied into this idea of citations being terribly important, but we know, and of course that ties into journal metrics such as the impact factor. PLOS was one of the first organisations that came up with article metrics, and this is one of the first papers that actually I was involved with publishing at PLOS Medicine, which has a very snazzy title, which I'm sure helped with the the fact that it's been hugely read. But you wouldn't get a sense of how important this was, I think, just from the citations, or it had lots of citations. The most striking thing was the readership, and you can dig down into that and look at it in a quite sophisticated way. And there are many other companies that are doing similar things now. Okay, so this is my group that I'm involved with. In fact, I'm the only person who I work on it full-time, although we're supported by 9 institutions across Australia, which includes UWA and Curtin. And our job, I think, is twofold. Is that we want to advocate and have a discussion about open access, but we also want to provide support and provide information, and we try to do all of that on the website. So I'd encourage you to look at it. I want to end really with just a couple of slides. So I'm going to skip over these. When we're talking about open access and when we're talking about the future of scholarly publishing, there are some really interesting things happening. And one of the things that is happening that I think we've not been quite so aware of is how the power in publishing has been concentrated increasingly over the past few years in a very small number of players. The reason why I think it's so important to have discussions and talks like this and make people aware of what's going on is because of graphs like this. So this is a paper that was published in PLOS ONE last week, and what it essentially shows is how publishing has changed, or the control of publishing has changed between 1970 and 2015, and it's called the oligopoly of academic publishers. And what you can see, for example, just look at chemistry. So chemistry has gone from having 40% of publications which were published by five publishers to, in the early 2000s, it was 80%. It's gone slightly down to 70%. But all of these graphs are going up. So in every area that you look of academic publishing, the control of publishing is happening with a smaller and smaller number of publishers. And I think that's something that we should be very aware of, because any future that happens for publishing is going to be increasingly controlled by a very small number of groups. And just one of those that is very powerful is Elsevier. And you don't often get Elsevier talking publicly about how much power they actually have in publishing, because they tend to not be too interested in having that discussion. But they are involved in a court case that they posted. Well, they kindly posted the court document online last week, or somebody did it on their behalf. And what they said was that, quite specifically, that Elsevier holds the copyright exclusive distribution rights to the works available through Science Direct, okay? And that is home to 1/4 of the world's peer-reviewed scientific literature. So there, I think, in two sentences, they've completely encompassed, or so encapsulated, really their power in the whole debate. And so my feeling is that this is what's happening right now, which is the publishing industry is trying to drive a lot of public policy in this area, but it is incredibly important that we have a bigger discussion, that it's not just the publishers that do it. And this was a slide that came out of one of a library in 2004, the Stanford Lane Medical Library, which I'm very fond of. They were great supporters of OA in the early days, but they've also been very involved in the bigger discussions around publishing. And it doesn't matter whether you think that the future is green open access or gold open access, or whether you think it's one thing or another. The most important thing, I think, is to have a wider debate about who's involved in it, and to not just assume that what is done by one set of individuals is going to work for all parts of publishing. So just to finish, this is Open Access Week in 2015. I'm trying to persuade them to, I think we're going to have some quite a lot of events in Australia, and if you're interested in getting involved, please let me know. And then these are all the ways that you can get in touch with me. Please look at our website. We have newsletters and we have listservs that you can sign up to, and I'm a great Twitterer, so please do get in contact by Twitter. Thanks very much.